It's no small myth that schooling initially started as a way to train factory workers in America. In that same regard, it's obviously no small myth that there are going to be a lot of intercept between companies trying to produce students into workers and education being defunded or funded mostly by that. The problem with American schools is that funding predominantly comes from businesses, and businesses and corporations have way too much of a hand in the standard education courses. Today on episode 5 of An All-American Nightmare, Education is Not an Enterprise, we'll be discussing the finer points of how American education became predominantly funded through taxes and corporations instead of through taxing of schools and local districts. We'll also be discussing the more broader points of how school funding is addressed. Now, I understand that every individual school has its own take on how schooling is funded and the various nuances therein, so we will be more generalizing it this time around. However, I will be linking in below some descriptions and research topics for individual subjects to be broached, and you can do that on your own time. I'd also like to establish very early on that this is going to be a very broad, sweeping overview. I understand that some schools have different versions of it, and there's also charter schools, but that was a bit outside of the scope of what I wanted to do here. And to keep this video inside an hour length, we're going to have to brush those over and cover them another day. To start the video off, we're going to be discussing the two distinct ways in which schools are typically funded. The first and foremost is that it's done through taxes, levies, bonds, things of that nature. Again, this doesn't expand to charter schools or private educations. Public education is funded through tax dollars, and while the federal government does have an oversight committee, there is very little ways that schools can gain federal funding unless they jump through a series of hoops. That'll be important later on the road. But school funding will break down to two primary categories: discretionary funding and categorical funding. The differences between these are as follows. This can be anything from school, pencils, paper clips, field trips, things of that nature. Then there's discretionary funds. These are typically the more common form of education funding, in which the funds have to go to very specific things. That is to say, if you're given money explicitly for computers, you can't spend it on STEM equipment, or musical supplies, or sports gear. And in a lot of cases, when it comes to school budget funds, most of the discretionary funding comes out of a general fund and has every year since 1967 been systematically reduced across the country, and there are some upticks, but for the most part it's been trending downward for a very long time. However, categorical funding has been going up recently, predominantly from businesses and spending. Again, in general, there are upticks and lows. This is very important because a lot of categorical funding is specifically related to how businesses are controlling where your funds go, whereas discretionary funding can cover the gaps. This is how funding is both simultaneously being defunded or lowered and also receiving more benefits. Now, there is a small twist to this. If the idea of companies giving out schools funding and then being very specific in how the school sends the funding doesn't sound a little Orwellian to you, imagine it this way. The categorical funding isn't explicitly done in a way of, hey, this is money just for computers. It'll typically be given to schools in the form of, say, administrative overcosts. So let's say a company, we'll just for sake of argument say the Koch brothers, gave a bunch of schools administrative funding by discretionary means. That means the school could use it for administrative funding, but they could also use it to pay for a field trip, or pay to do renovations, or pay for new textbooks. Whereas with the categorical funding, they can only spend it on administrative costs. What typically happens is this is eaten up by administrative salaries. That's why over the years the amount of administrators in schools has increased and the amount of teachers has gone down along with their pay. In a lot of cases, categorical pay is tied to teacher funding. Teaching isn't exactly paid for in the exact same way that you would for a factory worker or a retail associate, but again, that varies state by state, so we're not going to go too far into that. But the other thing, too, is that the lobbyists of the government actually have a large hand in education as well. In fact, a lot of schools are given funding categorically if they jump through hoops all the same, which means that companies can completely control what schools are doing based upon how their categorical funding works. This is why schools have certain textbooks. Typically, when it's discretionary funding, the school is not exactly given a ton of money over the board, and they have to spread it thinly, so they tend to buy the cheapest and most accessible equipment. Categorical funding removes that ability by funneling all the funds into a very specific means. The problem is, though, is that if you want to get the company to keep giving you categorical funding, you're going to buy a textbook that tends to paint them in a good light. This is essentially a catch-22 for teachers. To have the most up-to-date information requires you to jump through the hoops of a corporate overlord, whereas if you decide to break free and stick to your principles, you're going to have to be doing a lot more work in the long run. It's not necessarily exploitation, but it's pretty damn close. This also goes into the point of schools in Mississippi, for example, or Alabama, have some of the lowest performing test scores of all time and of the nation as a whole, while their administrators make the highest amount in the entire nation combined. Which is pretty sad that the school with the lowest graduating classes and the lowest performing kids tends to have administrators that receive the highest amount of money. And you can bet your bottom dollar that is most mainly by design. But I'm sure you're wondering how we ever got to this point in the first place. Well, it starts back with President Richard Nixon. You see, when Nixon was in office, there was a huge draw for schools to be funded and overcharged and for basically the public taxes to be cut to support a very, very strange understanding by the Republican Party at the time and also American at large about how taxes worked. So obviously the first thing that they needed to do was start cutting taxes, but where? Well, schools, obviously. I mean, at the time, schools were basically funded by real estate dollars in the same area. And of course, inner cities were predominantly full of black kids. So what do? You start making it so if the schools are funded by the real estate values and the suburbs make a lot of money, but the inner cities really don't due to gentrification and ghettoization, you can essentially defund kids, make them low underperformers, keep them ignorant, and then therefore better exploit them. Which also runs hand in hand with Nixon starting the drug war, Nixon's having the war in Vietnam continue, and virtually everything that Nixon stood for, followed by pretty much every Republican president after him. So yeah, this is one of those times where we're going to have to split the partisan line here and leave this entirely at the feet of Republicans, although I do have to admit that Democrats have been pretty helpful in making this in the first place, mainly because they're owned by the same corporate overlords. But I'm digressing. So that's how it happened. Essentially, schools wanted to make a lot of money, government wanted to control people, well, predominantly corporations wanted to control people, and so the two went hand in hand. But why exactly are companies so interested in getting access to children? Well, think of it this way. Children are the workers of tomorrow, in more way than one. Children don't have a lot of critical thinking abilities. They're designed by both biology and nurturing to pretty much believe everything they're taught. The reason for this is because that's how survival works. If someone tells you don't go into the river, there's an alligator there, you have to defend on the fact that they're going to prove you right, and that's to protect you. Now, this is not a defense of people outright lying to children in order to protect them. The think of the children myth is pretty much just a way for adults to get their opinions confirmed without having to actually back it up. But think about the other things that are happening in this time frame. The drug scares going on, the war on drugs, which is mainly designed to profit both the exploitation of the drug trade in Vietnam and also pharmaceutical companies selling massive amounts of drugs to people and to perpetuate, as of course, the racist bylaws launched by the government at the time, predominantly against people of color. So now we're going to have not only a group of people that are entirely being systematically discriminated against and flatlined out of education, but what's more so is that there was also another big thing going on at the time, the hippie movement and civil rights era. Well, a lot of people noticed that children were, the predominant amount of anti-government groups were young people, the hippie generation, and kids growing up who were the children of hippies. So what do? Well, we can't have another generation of hippies running around that are curtailing us from essentially exploiting people's civil liberties through paranoia. So let's start indoctrinating their children. And let's do it at a very young age. And in order to perpetuate this, we can't just come out and say, the schools are going to teach this and that's what's going to happen. They did it more nefariously, specifically targeting schools that were underperforming to require corporations to keep paying them in order to operate. Ever notice how inner city schools seem to have a ton of vending machines and low access to the food and lunch programs, and those programs are constantly being undercut? That's not just so the companies can make money off of children, although that is a big thing because kids don't exactly have the understanding that they're being exploited through corporations. That's also to make sure that if the schools ever speak out against it, they'll lose their funding, their jobs, and potentially the money forward. You're essentially holding teachers hostage to continue propaganding to children. But there's another thing too. Teachers tend to be a bit more on the liberal side of things. They tend to be progressing forward ideas. Young teachers getting out of college and going into the workforce always tend to have the best access to technology. Right now, if you go into school, a teacher who's 25 and recently trying to do their student teaching is going to have a greater grasp on technology and the pulse of America and civil injustice than a teacher who's been teaching for 40 plus years and essentially has their curriculum down to a swap out system at this point in time. This was also a problem for corporations, which is why corporations also started inspiring schools to send younger, more energetic teachers to ghettoized and disenfranchised schools that they also helped disenfranchised, and keeping the older, more tired and drawn-out teachers in nice, easy schools with nice, white, suburbanite kids. Because, those hardcore teachers that have been working in the biz for a while deserve to enjoy their twilight years. This is an entire pile of crap. In reality, what's happening is the corporations know that young teachers will help students use the new technologies and inspire them to go out and fight civil injustice, and so putting them into, quote, ghetto schools, which is really inner city schools, but trust me, I worked as a teacher, the term ghetto schools thrown around quite a bit. It's designed to break them. The movie The Freedom Riders, despite its very racist overtones, is pretty much a wet dream and a pipe fantasy at this point in time. If you go and work in ghetto schools, teachers just aren't expected to do well. It's not seen as, even if you work extremely hard and do very well, you're not going to get pushed anywhere. You're just going to be spending a lot of time burning out. The harder you work in a inner city school or a lower performing school, the more you're going to get tired and the more you're going to try harder for students. But eventually, you're just getting to the point where you stop trying. And at that point in time, when you're full of malice and vigor and all the energy's been drained out of you, then they move you over to another school to work with. It's a way that corporations use to break teachers down so they don't exploit the fact that they're exploiting children. It's not a conspiracy. It's a pretty well-known practice. In fact, if you go and talk to a lot of teachers, you'll notice that a lot of them, quote-unquote, get their baptism by fire by teaching at these inner-city schools, which are pretty much dens of exploitation. Vending machines, low access to educational, extracurricular activities, and a lot of lower funding. Trust me, I worked in an inner-city school in the middle of Seattle, and then got to work at a Bourbonite school. The differences were quite stark in a variety of ways. I'm not just talking about the fact that one of them has a smartboard. But this is also to offer another cruel access for people. Corporations aren't in the business of making intelligent people. They're in the business of making workers. Workers that are just smart enough to push the buttons and run the machines, but not so smart enough to figure out that they're being exploited. In fact, even in the last few years, the recent influx of educated children coming out and claiming to be socialists or communists, despite not really understanding what it means because they don't really know what they're talking about, recently has come because of the internet age, and corporations have been very quick to shut down internet access to schools. Except cellular exists, kind of curtails it. But I remember growing up as a kid when cell phones and smartphones were just starting to come out and be a big thing for the public to have. There was a lot of push by a lot of different companies and a lot of different public access groups to keep cell phones out of schools. Cell phones were a distraction. Kids would be too busy texting and paying attention in class. If you find a kid's cell phone, they have to go to the office. This extreme punishment for really just having a small device. That is your personal property, by the way. And then when you're done with school, you can go and pick it up at the end of the day. But then we look at how I was teaching. By the time I got to my student teaching jobs, a lot of students were using their phones to fact-check information. It was a source of access to information that makes a lot of other access the corporations do mute. You don't have to buy the corporation-approved curriculum or the corporation-approved textbook if you can just assign kids projects through their cell phones that they can do. Writing projects, research projects, video and audio media stuff. It curtails a lot of those problems. The kids don't have to use computer labs because they have a computer in their hand. The kids don't need to learn how to write essays or waste money with paper and pencil when they can type it, which honestly, despite the fact a lot of people think handwriting is a dying art, most people type everything up anyways, so it's not really a big skill to have. I mean, all things considered. But that's exactly how it works. That's why schools right now are kind of in a catch-22. There's this need to urbanize and revolutionize for the modern age, but there's also a lot of institutional systems that keep the kids held back. The idea that students can't use a calculator in school anymore because it's quote-unquote cheating at math, but the first thing you get when you go out into college or get into the real world is they give you a calculator to do your work on because it's a lot more accurate, goes to show you that schools are that locked into an anti-technological standpoint because the corporations don't have as much control to run schooling. It also requires schools to adopt new policies, which also goes against corporations. The corporations don't want thinkers. They want drones to come out, grab a job, go to work, and not consider how badly they're being screwed. And this isn't my conspiracy either. This is a well-known fact that's been disputed and tossed around as a joke in public discourse for about 20 years now, and was pretty readily accepted as a fact as far back as the 1980s. There's also another group that helps corporations accomplish their tasks. Perhaps you've heard of them. The Parent Teachers Association. Trust me, we'll have a video on them coming up shortly. But the PTA is not exactly just a group of parents offering to chaperone kids at dances. In reality, the PTA, that is to say the National PTA, is an organization that functions as a pseudo-special interest group. They're allowed to move things in and out of schools and allow corporations to exact more control on a more basal level for outdoor activities. If schools want to have a dance where they can play music and let kids be free and enjoy a few hours alone from their parents having fun and being kids, but the corporation won't let the PTA get enough chaperones, well, I guess the kids don't have anything better to do than go home and do the rest of that homework we've assigned them to normalize them taking work home and working for free. The National PTA also has another thing with moral considerations. Kids can't play certain music in school because it's offensive. Kids can't wear certain outfits in school because they're offensive. Kids can't use certain language in school because it's offensive. Don't speak out against the authority because then again, that's offensive. Don't do certain projects, don't do certain things. Regulation, regulation, regulation. It's funny that a group of people who pretty much live on the fact that they constantly ask other people to vote away from regulation have such a iron grip on controlling people's thought process. And this is a big important thing. If students are taught to be regulated, they make better workers. Workers are supposed to show up to work at a certain time, wear certain clothes, and not speak out against the authority that's bending them. The fact that this makes total sense for a workplace aspect with lobbyists in government, but wouldn't be applied to schools, which are just a microcosm of the governmental agency and corporatization, is really astounding to a lot of people. It's missing the forest for the trees. If corporations control the government, they also control the schools because the politicians write the rules for schooling. Which segues into our next big way that corporations control schooling, through government. Now, here's my thing. Schooling should be controlled in some way. There should be a federal standard that students have to meet for schooling. I'm not saying you can't have your kid homeschooled. I'm just saying that there should be a federal standard to make sure that all schools are performing to par. And that it should be not so much regularly enforced, but it should be the barest minimum that we allow schools to let their children go through. That being said, there isn't one right now. Most school curriculum is actually written at the state level, and state legislators establish their own standards. Well, we already know that pretty much being a politician means you're taking corporation money. That's how lobbyists work. That's how campaigns work. This also extends to the fact that corporations are paying government employees how to run schooling educational systems, and that's how it expands outward. Now, my state of Washington is not sin-free from this. I know I like to brag about how great my state is, but really, Washington has some pretty big issues with this. There are schools that take a lot of funding from the government, and while we do tend to allow them more freedom in operations, we still have concepts like white privilege, the horrors of the American-Filipino War, for example, and other big glaring issues in history completely glazed over because it shines a bad light on American exploitation. Hell, the book that I was reading as a school kid, the American Pageant History book, was paid for by a corporation. It was a pretty cheap book, all things considered, and the only reason the kids bought it was because this company never gave money for discretionary funding on textbooks, and this is before the digital revolution. So, yeah, it's one of those things, it's not a conspiracy, it's just standard practice here in America. So that's exactly why corporations want children, to be taught in certain ways, to make certain workers, and to move them out. And this expands farther into academic curriculum. It's not just that they're establishing the rules, it's also what schools aren't allowed to do. Art programs, for example, are usually the first thing to be defunded and also the least likely to receive funds. Same with after-school sports. Sports don't make a lot of money. In fact, the high school football game isn't like it used to be where they make a ton of money on concessions. In fact, most of the money the school makes through concessions is used to pay off purchasing those concessions. A lot of that money goes back to the distributors who gave them the product in the first place. And whatever money's kind of left over usually goes to pay for the coaches who, in a lot of cases, are volunteer, but still do need to get paid because they work as school employees. So that being said, yeah, the schools don't get a lot of funding for extra sports because you can't make a lot of money off of high school students. You can make them off money when they go to college, and you can essentially use them as a slave labor force, which we often do. My Well, let's just say my home state is home to Gonzaga University, and they're one of the big March Madness groups, and let's just say there are no stranger to controversy in that department. And this expands forward even more so. Ever heard of parents saying they don't teach kids about handwriting no more, and they don't teach kids how to drive a stick shift, yuck. You ever question why that is? Why don't we teach kids how to write? Well, we do teach them how to write, we just don't teach them cursive. And that's because it's an artistic form. It's letting kids write down their ideas, and it's an artistry, which is a form of expression. We don't want workers to express themselves. We want them to come in, do their job, and take their work home and do it for free. That's what we want kids to do, so art programs get defunded. Even though the fact of this pandemic shows more than anything else that the artist is quintessential to a society, not only does empire fall art, but if we didn't have Netflix and a bunch of shows to binge watch at the start of the corona epidemic, most of us would probably be dead by now. Killed by our spouse. So, there's that aspect. What about driver's ed? Well, let's just say the insurance cost of keeping a bunch of cars at a school and the automotive tech to keep them up and running really comes down to a case-by-case basis. I went to a school where there was an automotive club that actually kept up all the cars that would be dealt with by the driving instructor. And a lot of the times, the driving classes were happened after night, 5 to 5 o'clock to 7 o'clock, and they had a big parking lot to train multiple drivers. This is a really good idea. As far as stick shift goes, most cars aren't stick shift anymore, so there's no real need to learn them outside of the basics. But again, this is by funding. Why do schools have to teach kids to drive a car? That's the parents' job. That's just extra money they want to put forth. Why do kids have to learn how to learn cursive in school? Isn't the parent supposed to teach the kid how to write then read? Well, in theory, yeah. But schools also have vested interest in that. If the kid can't write, they can't express their own ideas, they can't put forth their own concepts. And that just makes for a better drone. If the student can't have a car, they can't just leave the school whenever they want and go operate how they want or have freedom. They're stuck to get up, go to school/work, do your job, come home, repeat, and rinse. That's what people like corporations. That's what makes a good worker. It's what makes a good drone. So let's move on to a more glaring aspect. Obviously, we know that schools are full of children that they're potentially lifelong buyers. This is also why schools tend to put a lot of vending machines with Coke and sugary drinks and spend a lot of money on poor school food programs. And why food programs are constantly at the threat of being cut, despite the fact that most students rely on them for a lot of their meals because they're in low-income houses. Oh yeah, keeping students poorly fed. Interesting concept. What about the fact that children are easily to control? If you don't tell the student any of the nuances of government or nuance of classes by the result of you might lose your funding, the kids don't know that. They just expect that what you're teaching them is the gospel proven fact. So you have a room full of children that are not only hungry, but now you're essentially feeding them whatever propaganda you're told to. And again, I would have gotten into this with prepackaged curriculums, but we all know how that went out. How about the fact that children are political movers? Corporations have known for a long time that the children are going to be the next true voters, which is why they spend so much time to disenfranchise the students straight out of high school. It's to wear them down. Just like young, virulent teachers, when the students get out of high school, they're eager to go fight social injustice. It's a concept of being a young teenager. You want to fight for a cause. But if you're not fighting for an imperialistic war, they're not interested in it. So what do? They constantly disenfranchise you to voting and make you trivialized and patronize you with fake elections and fake voting and pushing you to popularity contests. So you won't vote up until the time where you actually have some funding and money after you've been in the workforce for a few years and you're kind of numb to the idea, whereupon they will terrify you with the idea that young kids are messing things up and that you need to vote their way. What about the fact that there's a difference between educated and intelligent? Students who don't do well in schooling, neurodivergent people, I'm looking at you, those are students who think differently. They have a different view of aspect on life. They have a different view of things. They don't want to go in and do the 9-to-5 job and do the grind and everything else. So they're exploited. Well, this is a good idea. If you're constantly in fear of someone else coming and taking your job and the us versus them mentality, you'll be more likely to snuggle up to the authority figures because it's us versus them and I want to be on the side that's right? So this is, again, corporations using the benefit of their schools having a social casting and fascism systems to endorse workers to stick together. You stick within your group, you don't leave your group. You don't talk to people who are exploited in different aspects. The teacher doesn't talk to the janitor doesn't talk to the cook, and the cook doesn't talk to anybody because he's out back having a smoke break for the third time this day because it's a very, very stressful job working in a kitchen. But let's also now move on to how schools function in America specifically. Did you know that students in America spend a lot of their waking hours engaged in schoolwork? Not only do students go to school for 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, which is essentially the American workday, but students are also incredibly heavily regulated outside of schools. Dances and parties don't take place unless the school predominantly approves them, and the student government has no say in that. If the school decides they're not going to do a party, you're not having it. And some of these various parties and stuff are always done through school approved things, which of course we all know our parents have a great taste in music, now don't they? This also extends into homework. You see, if kids are away from school, they're having fun, they're enjoying times, they're talking about what they learned in school, they're digesting ideas. No, 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 can't have that, can't have free thought. What you have to do, give them a ton of homework. They have 6 classes a day. Well, every class should have 1 hour of homework a night. That's 6 hours. That's 12 total hours of schoolwork, in theory. Concept being, well, if the kid's constantly doing schoolwork at home, they're not going to think much about it. They're just going to complete it and keep going. And again, it does, make them more accepting to the idea of taking work home to finish it and working for free. Then there's school sports. Well, that's just basically money back into the hands of corporations. The concession stands, potentials for students to go out there and get scholarships so they can pay for college, which is totally just exploitative at all ends. And throw all this together on top of a higher social structure, a fascistic system of operations, and the fact that the students are often probably not getting a lot of sleep because what little social time they do have is dealing with all the normal social things that come with student life, and you have essentially the following outcome. A generation of mentally exhausted, physically drained, socially isolated, future consumer workers who from day one are taught obedience, follow the leader, and tasks as assigned, with no drive or ability to fight back, call out, or challenge the status quo in any way. In essence, you have the perfect worker. And if you don't believe me on that concept, think of how badly religion wants to get into schools. Think of how much the religious zealots and Christian persecution complex has been set up to drive them into schools. They desperately want access to a lot of children. The difference is that corporations beat them to the punch and are a lot more effective at this because they have more money and more resources. Children are the greatest resource in our society. They will take over when we are old and moldering in the ground. As a result, time and control over them as they're molded is the most important thing for a corporation. A corporation exists long past when the school bell ends and long past when a student graduates. As a result, they have a vested interest in worming their way into the next generation and tainting the batches. Fortunately, this story and this video have an ending of a high point. Because of technology, these ideas are getting more widely spread. Because of technology and because of the failure of American capitalism, these ideas are being spread. The system is breaking down. More children right now, especially my generation, who have known nothing but war, nothing but lies, and been treated like commodities all our life, have taught these lessons to our children and our friends' children. More students now than ever are open to the ideas of social injustice. More children now than ever are open to the ideas of progressivism and accepting members that our old civilization used to outcast and decry. Children now are more welcoming to a socialized understanding of government and to helping out other people and to working hard than the old corporations that are all about fear and hate. The old generation is dying out, and they will continue to die out. And the new generation coming up is not in the mood of playing the game that's been established thereon. So much like with these videos, everything that students listening to this do is accelerating that. And I'm damn happy to be a part of it. So that all my students out there listening to this who feel exploited, run down, and treated like a commodity at school, you're not far off the mark. You are being exploited. You are being mishandled. You are being systematically defunded to drive you to certain degrees. The game is stacked against you. And as far as that goes, that's how schooling's been for a long time, and unfortunately how it's going to be a long way after. I can't advocate for burning the whole system down and starting over from scratch, because as we saw with COVID, that's just not a thing we can do. But I will say this. If the game is stacked against you, and the house holds all the cards, and all you have is one roll of the dice, don't take the roll of the dice. Flip the board. Go the extra mile for you. Do different projects. Support teachers that actively want you to learn. Change the concepts. Start small social governments. Challenge your teachers. If they are producing outright lies, fact check them and take the evidence forward. Every single lie and every single exploit that you as students unveil to the school is one more bullet in the magazine when we take back education. If the school is lying to you and pandering to corporate interests, they have no right to demand that you follow the rules. They have no right to control what you learn, and they have no right to tell you what your worth is. If nothing else, learn what the corporations don't want you to learn for the sake of spiting them. Who are they to tell you what you can and cannot learn? Who are they to tell you what you can and cannot know? They just want a worker, but you're more than a worker. You're an academic, an artist, a scholar, a musician, a mechanic, an engineer, a builder, a doer, a designer. You are a font of creativity. And to lose you to a corporation is to give up on the game altogether. And I'm not giving up. Thank you for joining me for this short half hour. Again, I know this one was pretty brief, but I thought it was going to be eye-opening. Join me next time when we discuss teachers' unions and continue down the path of the All-American Nightmare to episode 6, For the Union!